we are striving to become like gods. We are, as we said earlier, we are like Icarus shooting for the moon. And if we don't hit the moon, we're going to be high up there somewhere, and it's going to be worth the struggle. It's going to be worth the adventure. It's going to be worth the risk, because we're going somewhere with this. We're going to put people on Mars. We're going to build a space station. We're not just going to sit here and wait for the kingdom of heaven to come to us. We're going to make the kingdom of heaven. And that is that is exactly the sort of riff that we started off this conversation with in the ancient world. The divide between, are we life affirming? Are we honoring the devas? Are we honoring our ancestors? And are we building?
Salvete Legionaries. I'm joined by a very special guest today. A lot of you who have been with the channel for a while probably watch a lot of similar content in this general sphere of things on YouTube. So a lot of you are probably familiar with the videos from GNOSTIC Informant. Of course, I've had both Uber Boyo and Jason Georgiani on my show before, and they've done a lot of collaborations before. But without further ado, GNOSTIC Informant, Neal, if you could just briefly introduce yourself to the Legionaries.
Yeah, man, thanks for having me on. Checking out your channel, looks pretty cool. And yeah, like you said, you had some good guests on that I'm aware of and have overlaps with. Yeah, my channel, GNOSTIC Informant, started about 5 years ago, and I just been interviewing people that I'm, studying their work, or someone else, some other content creator or something, or I'm making my own content, which is like documentary style videos on primary sources from antiquity, basically studying ancient history, mythology, early Christianity, Greek mythology, Roman religion, all that stuff.
Absolutely. And I guess we can just kind of jump right into the topic that I sort of wanted to bring up today. I've been doing a little bit of research both on my own and then also sort of an extension from stuff I've been learning in college. Most of my college classes so far have been terrible. But for some reason this semester I just got lucky and I got some pretty good ones. And we were reading the Upanishads in class, and it sort of got me into thinking about the different traditions and sort of their approach to agency, being as something static or more evolutionary, and then of course life denial and life affirmation. And with the Upanishads, I noticed the idea of Brahman being a very sort of constraining and static being and very life denying. Of course, the sort of Moshka being a rejection of the senses, of the pleasures, and eventually returning to Brahman, versus something like Hesiod's theogony, where it begins with chaos, and from chaos you get Gaia and Tartarus, and then the Titans, and then the gods. It's more evolutionary, more space for human agency and life affirmation. And I wanted to get your perspective, since a lot of your work is delving really deep into these texts and really extrapolating them.
Yeah, this is an interesting discussion that we're about to have, because when you look at the ancient world, you start to notice kind of like a divide between different schools of thought and how they look at the divine. And there's the plurality of the divine in existence, and of the flux of the cosmos, and that usually manifests itself in polytheism, and the idea of there being different forces at work, and you're kind of looking for the forces that you want to honor. And so you end up with something like Greek polytheism, Roman polytheism, Hinduism, or you might find another school of thought that is more about the monistic unity of all creation, all things going back to one source, one powerful, all-knowing, all-powerful God, Brahman, Yahweh. Sometimes this, like the Stoic Zeus, the Platonist one, the hen, and Zoroastrian cosmology, where there's Angra Manu versus Ahura Mazda, who is basically the Titan of wisdom, or the good god, and then Angra Manu being the restricting force. And so you look at all these theologies, and then you look at all these overlaps they have with the devas and the titans, and the demons versus the god, or the demons versus the Titans, or the Devas versus the Asuras. And then you start to go, huh. It's funny because it's not always the case that they all are aligned that the Devas are bad, for example. We think of demons as bad because of Christianity. And the Zoroastrians certainly thought that way too. They thought the Devas were these malevolent beings that were, forces behind the Anger Manu side. Whereas the Asuras were these other, more intelligent, more wisdom, forward-thinking beings. And they serve Ahura Mazda. And then you see that reflected in other mythologies, other theologies in different places. And it's like, it's not really clear that all of them are aligned on which of these are good, which of these are bad. So then you start to notice, like, there's a divide going on in the ancient world. They all understood this, though. They all seem to have understood that there was different types of gods from different, different like classes in a way. Some of them, like in Greek mythology, you can see the daimons being like good forces of inspiration and whatnot. Dionysus is called the good daimon, Agathos daimon. And then like a Prometheus is the fire bringer, and he brings the fire, and Zeus tries to prevent him from doing that and locks him up and chains him on a mountain in Scythia. And it's like, okay, there's definitely a divide going on here, and there seems to be a tend towards monistic thinking on one side and plurality thinking on the other side. And so and even the polytheistic, so to speak, people still had this idea of like a source where they're all kind of coming from. So it might be like, and at the end, it still might have a monistic bent to it, but they're more likely to not honor the so-called demiurge or creator god, and instead choose the ones who are, virtue bringing or light bringing gods. And so, yeah, that's something I've noticed in the ancient world. And as far as you brought up the Upanishads and talks like this, where this gets into this idea of like objectivity and like objective truth and objective reality and all this stuff. And now, like, only one God has all the power, and then the other gods are sort of benevolent or subservient to the one. And the Upanishads definitely pushes this idea that Brahman, is the all-knowing, all-powerful God, and we're supposed to be in tune with Brahman, get in tune with knowing yourself, becoming a guru, that type of thing. And then in Greek thought, the Platonists do the same thing, but it's virtue, chasing down virtue, chasing down the logos, reason. And Nietzsche had this idea that people who are chasing this were actually going down the wrong path, and that they were following this sort of lie, if you will, that virtue and objective reality is like something that's going to like lead us into some sort of, I don't know, better state, as Plato would say in the Republic. And so Nietzsche was saying, no, actually the true way is a balance between the reason and the life-giving forces like the Dionysian. So Apollonian, Dionysian. Apollonian is about reason and, like literate, like medicine. Like, for example, let me just go on a little quick detour. Apollo, the sons of Apollo, if you look at his offspring, they're the gods of like music, medicine, mathematics, like high IQ level thinking stuff. You look at Dionysian's offspring, like Priapus, for example, and it's like gods of, I don't know, life, gods of like the swelling of crops, this gods of being drunk and intoxicated, being inspired, that type of thing. And it looks like one of them's reason, one of them's like more of like, I don't know, vanity. But really, if you actually take a look, there's a balance that was in place that these ancients understood. And so I don't know. I guess I would say to that, it's like, yes, there is these tyrannical gods out there who are trying to make some sort of ends. They're trying to fulfill some sort of plan. They're sending a messiah. They're sending a kingdom. They want this to. There's some sort of end, some sort of state of eternal that they're trying to accomplish. Whereas the benevolent gods, I guess you would say, are more about the flux. They're more about the ever changing, the being versus becoming that you get in Parmenides. And it's like, it's fascinating how Parmenides' core project of being versus becoming ends up being kind of, in a way, Nietzsche's solution, because you have the Apollonian and the Dionysian, you have the flux, you have the state of eternal unchangingness, and then you have the gods who are kind of destructive, but they bring forth something that's like you need, which is life. Like Adam and Eve in the garden were just purely Apollonian. They couldn't eat from the fruit of the tree of the good of knowledge. They had to just follow and obey, like Muslims, like just yes, Yahweh, we'll do everything you say. And they lacked that serpent. They lacked that essence of life that only could be achieved by eating the fruit of knowledge. And so when it's one of these things that I look at throughout the ancient world, and it fascinates me that they all seem to have some sort of answer to this question about, are we here because we're supposed to be good people and virtuous and honorable, or are we here because we're supposed to enjoy ourselves, live life, leave a mark, or is there a little bit of balance between the both? And that's where I think this whole question, I think that's where all this this whole thing lies. And I still don't necessarily have the answer to this question, but I definitely think that it's not black and white, and that one that is, the sort of monistic, pick the right God side. I think they're wrong. I do.
Yeah, and going back to sort of the dialectic of the Apollonian Dionysian, of course, in Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche is looking at the early Greek tragedy. It doesn't have this sort of binary good and evil, obviously, that you get with Plato. And, I think what's interesting with Plato is he's trying to reconcile both the Heraclitean flux and then the Parmenides being, which is, very static. And, he's doing his best, but of course, as we see with Nietzsche and the philosophizing of the hammer, it's ultimately insufficient to sort of describe phenomena. And I think what's interesting is what happens in Greece is the opposite of what happens in India with Buddhism after Hinduism, because you begin with that static self, Atman, and then you go to Anatta in Buddhism, where they take a phenomenological approach, right? And it's the opposite in Greece. They have the Homeric ideal, which is rooted in the sort of the natural flux of honestly the non-primacy of the gods, because even in the Iliad, Diomedes defeats, I think, both Ares and Aphrodite. There's not a clear ultimate strength and authority in the gods. They have some level of vulnerability. And I think that's demonstrated with why Zeus punishes Prometheus. So going off of your point, I guess sort of what I would ask next is, in regards to you're mentioning certain traditions religiously that offer a bit of a contrast to that tyrannical sort of, the God you must fear, the God that punishes when you go against his mission. And I know you've mentioned Mithra before, and I think, would that be correct to say that's one of the instances where you're mentioning a sort of more life-affirming, more about agency and less so about this sort of domineering figure that has a clear path?
Yes, and Mithra is a good example of the middle way, I guess you would call it, because what Mithra, and this is how Plutarch describes him. When Plutarch talks about Mithras, when he uses him in the first time we see the word Mithras with an S at the end in Greek, is in Plutarch. So it's like you see this sort of like transitional fossil between the Persian Mithra, and the Roman Mithras, and it's right there in late first century Plutarch, where he says Mithras is the mediator between Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu. and he says Anger Manu is what we call Pluto. He's this underworld, dark and cold god. And you have to give him offerings. You don't just forget about him. You give him offerings. I think he says he like gives them like wolf blood or something mixed with something else, some sort of weird offering. And then he's like, Ahura Mazda is the god of light, and he's these, blah, blah, blah. You give him this, you give him that. But Mithra is the mediator between both. So in a way, what Plutarch is saying is you had this god named Mithras, who is this mediator between these two sides. And, he's this god of contracts and oaths. And in a way, what you're asking is, I'm going to, like, is he sort of this incarnation of what Nietzsche was trying to get at with this like balance? And I think he is, because what do you do when you have people who are using contracts and following oaths and actually keeping their honor? Is you have a society where people can decide on things for themselves and following up and keeping their merit on that, shaking hands with somebody saying, we agree to do this, instead of a etched in 10 commandment law code that's just eternal, unchanging. No one can mess with these 10 laws. Instead, Mithra gives you the option to be in the flux, but also to not just fall into it, but to set up your own contract with whatever. And I think that's why Mithra is so fascinating to me. And it's what's so fascinating about that is, I don't know if Plutarch even knew this, but Mithra descends from another tradition where he's a dyad, Mithra Varuna. And these are both different binding gods. And in the Rig Veda, it's really unclear exactly what Varuna is. Some people try to connect him with Uranos, heaven. That's possible. If that was the case, it'd be like you have Mithra, who's this like solar light bringing contract god, and he's in a and he's himself in a contract with heaven itself, which would also kind of show you what the Roman Mithras looks like, where he's sort of like in control of the cosmos, and he's like turning the heavens by himself, turning the constellations as they go. He's holding the grapes in his hand. He's got that very Dionysian imagery in some cases. He kills the bull. He slays the bull, which the blood is magic, and it gives you eternal life if you washed in the blood of the bull. So it's like you can see with Mithras, you could see a balance between the sort of plurality of things and the monistic sort of follow reason. These are the objective things that are good. Follow those things. So I think, yes, that's what I would say.
And going off of that, I think another thing that's interesting about Mithra, obviously in some of the traditions, they have him being birthed through, I believe it's called petrogenesis, where he's born out of rock, right? So sort of
Yes.
To describe almost like a titanic figure coming from the earth rather than having divine birth. Obviously, other traditions say he had a divine birth, but this particular one interested me because I
the
very
most
much
common one too. Him being born from a rock is the most like established one.
Right. And even going to the bull slaying, again, I think what's interesting, first of all, he comes from the earth. So it's a natural occurring phenomenon in a sense. It's not necessarily he comes from a higher being.
Right.
And I think that's important.
It is.
Along with the slaying of the bull, to me, also represents a triumph over nature in some sense, an overcoming of nature. And you bring up contracts, right? What is overcoming nature but not asserting our own laws, creating institutions? So I think that's really important to come out of that. And, another thing I wanted to ask is, going to Plutarch and the influence that Mithra had on the Romans. I read somewhere that Mithra was the most threatening symbol to the Christianization of the Roman Empire because the legion held Mithra so close to them with the cult of Mithra. And I guess I wanted to ask about that specifically and sort of what that sort of conflict was, and then what Mithra represented to the Romans who had appropriated him from the East.
Yeah, right off the bat in the early second century, like with Justin Martyr, you get what looks like to me as very nervous responses to Mithras from these Christians, because they both kind of spring up very close to the same time. You start learning about Mithras. One of the earliest sources that mentions Mithras as the Bull Slayer is from Statius in his what is it called? The Seven of Thebes. It's a retelling of the Thebaid by a Roman in Latin, not in Greek. And in that in that long, epic, Homeric style poem, there's it honors Mithras, and it calls him the rosy red Titan. It calls him Osiris. It equates him with Osiris. Let me see if I can just pull it up real quick. I think I have it over here somewhere. Hold on. I might read this out, and I'll just kind of explain to you what I mean by this.
Sounds good.
Yeah. So here, I could find it pretty quick. It is, here it is. It says, that's a different part of the Thebaid. So it's coming up here. It says, "O garden of hospitality, attend the right hand side of Juno's fields. Be present, love us, make us fortunate. Whether, as in the rituals of Persia, we call you rose red Titan, or we say, O bountiful Osiris, you shape yourself as he who twists the horns of bulls in Perse's rocky caverns, holy Mithras." And that's from the 1st century. And then I'm trying to think of where I was going. And then yes, Christians. When you start getting sources about Christians, Justin Martyr is very nervous. It could tell. He says Mithras had rituals with bread and wine and accompanied words of consecration. He had his own Eucharist, and he's basically his way of combating this is going, oh, demons, they knew that Christ was going to come, so they handed down the mysteries of Mithras so that the initiates should be baptized in water and do sort of a Eucharist and expect a kind of resurrection, because that's what demons would do. They would mock the true Christianity. And so and I'm reading that and going, dude, you sound nervous that you guys are the ones copying Mithra. And sure enough, Celsus tells us this. Celsus is the first source we have hostile to Christianity. So sometime in the 130s, it says that according to Origen, he wrote during the reign of Hadrian. So when we're talking 130s, and in the 130s, early on, Celsus figures is one of the first people to notice Christianity, and he says this is no different than, he's like, these people are like Mithraists. He's like, they're like Jews. They want to be like Jews, and they want to follow Adam and Eve and all this weird stuff. He's like, but their rituals with the Eucharist is like Mithraism. So yes, the Christians, and then there's other sources from trying to think of his Firmicus Maternus is one of them. Arnobius of Sicca is one of them. They both say the same thing Justin Martyr says. They blame demons on why Mithraism has so many ritualistic similarities to Christianity. And so the Christians feel very threatened by Mithraism because they can, from what I gathered, they're threatened by the idea that there is these other rites that are coming, or that are in the Roman world, that are using Eucharistic rituals and baptisms and being washed in the blood of bulls instead of lambs. And so, yes, Mithraism is definitely a threat to Christianity. Even later in late antiquity, when Mithraism sort of it becomes like a secret mystery cult underneath it's the esoteric male only initiation cult underneath the exoteric public Sol Invictus cult. So they're Sol Invictus and Mithra are kind of the same god, and sometimes they're depicted as two twins, but most of the time you're going to see Sol Invictus Mithras as one name, or Sol Invicti Mithrae, two Sol Invictus Mithra. So you can see it's one god. And so even late antiquity, what you start to see Christians kind of adopting and kind of riffing off of the Roman imperial cult. December 25th is one of them. The pagans were the first to use that as an official feast date in 270 AD, and then in the 4th century, sometime in the 300s, then Christians adopt that as a date. And also they start doing Sunday instead of Saturday, and then they built their churches facing the sun. They do all these weird things with solar imagery. They start depicting Jesus with solar rays in the 4th century. You can see he looks like Mithras in some of those depictions. And so I think these Christians knew that if they didn't sort of adopt and sort of play along with what Mithraism was doing, they could have lost out. So, yeah.
It's interesting. Funny enough, what I'm about to mention, I got from reading Yukio Mishima's Sea of Fertility tetralogy. In the 3rd book, Temple of Dawn, he discusses Buddhism. And at one point, he's discussing the figure of Dionysus as having its origins in the East. And, he mentions Dionysus originally, being man and then going through a resurrection and becoming God. And attached to the figure of Jesus, and then even Mithra. I've also heard some interpretations of the bull slaying as a sort of representative of the cycle of life and rebirth. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but I've seen something like that. And, you begin to see, of course, the synthesis of all these syncretic, faiths coming together, whether it's different practices and whatnot. So I think that's very fascinating. But going to the figure of Mithra, and then, Mithraism, contra Christianity. Another thing that I think is important to note, of course, is the vital aspects of Mithra as affirming the certain hierarchical elements of the Roman legion contra the Christians, right? Because I think that from what I've heard, generally the final convertees to Christianity were from the legion. Of course, early on, you have the slave populations that were very much attracted to, as Nietzsche would put it, the slave moral valuation of Christianity.
Women and slaves were the first Christians for sure.
Right. And even going to like Uber Boyo's video where he did, I think it was called like Christianity was wokeism to Rome and stuff like that. It all echoes together the martial aspect and the agency that's tied to martial cultures, which I think is another thing maybe we ought to explore. I was reading Iranian Leviathan, Giorgiani's book, and going to the Scythians, even, who in a lot of ways, even their culture was very open in a lot of ways. Of course, Giorgiani mentions the female roles in battle. I believe it was I forget her name. It was a Scythian. I believe it was a Scythian queen who beheaded Cyrus the Great in one account. Of course, Tomyris, right. So I guess, one other thing I sort of wanted to explore and maybe ask is the importance of the martial element, military societies and the military caste, because, not to drone on, but even going back to the Hindus, seems to be a reason why the religion is structured the way it is, to allow for the Brahmin class, the priestly caste, to be above the warrior caste to some respect. So it seems that the military caste or the military cultures have more agency in that to be strong militarily, you have to deal with physics. You have to deal with like natural physical forces. So I guess my question is, do you sort of see a connection there in regards to, let's say, warrior religions, agency contra maybe the tyrannical god that is sort of laying out this very ascetic path?
Yes. What was that last part that you asked again? The last question?
Yeah, just sort of the warrior caste contra the priestly caste. The priestly caste, yeah.
Yeah, and so again, there's like, you start seeing different societies having different balances of power, where I think the priestly class sort of dominates in late antiquity, because they start figuring out how to use dogma on the people, and then you start to see that the warrior class is subservient to the priestly class. But then there's other cultures where the warrior class is definitely, especially like Germanic North, you see the warrior class is definitely the most powerful. But there's also a balance. You have like the Druids, and you have like the Brahmins in their little society, their caste, and then the warrior caste over there in the East. The Flamins and Roman Dumenzel writes about this too. Dumenzel sees as like this tripart system of king, lawgiver, priestly class, and warrior class, and he sees all these Indo-European cultures having this sort of tripart division, and there was a balance. And I think at some point, what started happening, and this is sort of like the backdrop of Plato's Republic, is you start seeing an imbalance of who can take the most power. Usually, is the people who have the weapons, the strength, the military, and then the priestly class has to come up with some sort of noble lie in order to keep a balance between the might. Instead of having just might is right, they can they can sort of introduce some sort of laws that bring forth virtue. And then what happens when that, and then once they start getting a hold of how that works, they start using these noble lies, and it gets to a point where now you can completely control the state with sort of like a bishop, which means overseer, in every area, where there's like a client king or puppet leader, and then he's literally just got like a bishop over his shoulder, watching his every move, reporting back to the central bishops, or the philosopher king, and telling them what to do. And so there's a struggle between these two classes for sure. And I think once again, it goes back to the balance idea, is this is like so central to government today, where you start seeing like branches of government and how they check each other. That is like, I don't know, it's one of the most ancient struggles that we still have to this very day. And it goes back to the priestly versus the warrior class, and we still see it today.
Yeah, and even in the United States, I mean, now I don't take this 100% to heart, but when Curtis Yarvin, for example, talks about the cathedral, the literati, and the academic class, I think it's deeper than that. But just taking that as a case example, as a sort of new priestly caste, right? Because if you think about it, I mean, who determines morality in American society today? It's absolutely the academic institutions,
Yeah.
in part, collaboration with the media, and the military is castrated in America today. They have no institutional power, really. They're completely subservient to the political class, whereas historically, as we've sort of explored, this just wasn't the case. So
Yeah.
America, being Anglophonic and mercantile, just has a new priestly caste, which is more material and less to do with the transcendent. And going off of another thing you were saying, sort of made me think of Julius Evolas' pagan imperialism, and he talks about the Gibelline figure. So both the head of the religion and the state, or even Pontifex Maximus is another word he uses in relation to the Roman emperor's role in heading the faith as well. And I think what's interesting here is, again, I think it is really a battle between faiths which affirm agency and life affirmation versus this sort of ascetic structure. And maybe it's a little bit premature to assert this, but when I see the martial faiths being tied to obviously force of arms, being tied to physis, that does sort of require an assertion of agency versus even if we go to philosophy, Plato's philosophy very much deals with the transcendent. And I think even in Mythos and the role that Mythos plays in later Greece versus original Greece, and actually this will probably be my next question for you, because are you familiar, for example, with the sort of Icarian equivalent in Nordic mythology with Wayland the blacksmith?
Not really, no.
That might be an interesting thing. So I'll just briefly summarize it, because I think this sort of applies to this. I think we can sort of agree that Platonism certainly sows the seeds which furnishes Christianity, right?
Yeah.
In Rome, and this sort of shift from the tragedy, from the sort of Homeric Greek moral valuation, to Socrates and Plato, of course, introducing the moral good contra evil. The story of Icarus in its modern inception was written by a literist, Ovid, right, in 8 AD, I believe it was. Of course, after Platonism had more or less shifted the whole method of moral valuation. And you look at the Nordic equivalent, Nordic paganism being a lot more life affirming. And in the myth of Icarus, of course, Icarus flies too close to the sun. It's a story of warning and hubris, but I don't think it was originally meant to be that way because of who was asserting this myth. And you look at the Nordics with Wayland the blacksmith. Essentially, he successfully escapes his captor. He seduces his daughter, turns the captor's daughter into his lover. It's a story of triumph and cunning and a celebration of hubris. And I'm led to believe that perhaps the early conception of Icarus in Greek mythology was probably not a warning, but it was probably the priestly caste sort of replaced with Platonism and the literati, as the methods of control, sort of turning it on his head. And yeah, absolutely, there's parallels to this sort of modern thing. But like how much of maybe it sort of even reflects worldview warfare, which is something Giorgiani talks about. How important do you think this is, this sort of struggle of, let's say, the priestly or academic caste to sort of rework morality through fear, essentially? I guess I would say. I don't know if you agree with that.
Oh, it made a lot of sense because what you touched on with the Icarus myth, it is sort of like a scare. It's trying to scare. I don't know if you want to say it's the author is relaying a sort of story that's like a warning for people who try to be too big, try to get too strong, and you'll end up like Icarus, right? Hubris, or if you will. It's like it's in contrast to being virtuous and being stoic and sort of following what you were given by providence. So it's like submit. Don't be like Icarus. Submit. Here's your role. You're a pleb. Be a pleb, or you're a patrician, or you're equestrian military rank. You have to. That's it. You have to just be the best version of that, or else you're going to end up like Icarus if you try to elevate your status to something bigger. You're just going to fly too close to the sun. You're going to end up like Icarus. And it is a very useful myth for the Middle Platonist world, who are trying to keep things in order, trying to keep their power, trying to keep everyone where they're at. And but like there's also this idea that you do want to shoot for the moon, because even though you're not going to get to the moon, you're still going to get very, very high, and you're going to reach a place that's going to be that you never even thought. Or you might even, maybe you're shooting for the sun and then you end up on the moon or something. Like, you want to reach for as high as possible, and even if you don't reach it, you still end up higher than where you were at. So yes, I can see the idea of this sort of inversion of this story being sort of like a tale of like fear, putting fear into people, of trying to be puffed up, because you'll end up rising above and threatening the status quo. And so mythology was sort of very useful to especially the world that Ovid was a part of. I know there's a version that Apollodorus told, but that's 3rd century BC also. So that even in that case, it's still post-Platonist world where there's this idea of like virtue and the one, all that stuff. And so what was the second part you asked?
Sort of comparing that to in modernity, we still have, instead of a priestly case, now we have the literati doing that.
Yes, I absolutely agree. I mean, the academic sort of class, I've been running in these circles for like 5 years now, and there's this sense that they have things figured out as far as good, or as far as like morality, and I don't. It's weird. It's like this. There's like this sort of like very liberal leftist sort of I don't know. There's like this current that people are like sucked into. In this, I was sucked into it myself, and I still get sucked into it, because you want to be accepted by your peers. You want to be established. You want people to take you seriously. So you start acting and talking in a way that you wouldn't be without that if you weren't in this situation. So you start getting people who are very performative, and it's like there's a sort of binding of people in these sort of places that they end up pushing a sort of moral code that they don't even really understand why. And it's sort of interesting that it comes from academia and not from a religious place, because you would think, because that's the type of behavior you find in churches. You join a church, I don't know if it's a Catholic church, and you're rising up the ranks of different, whatever those ranks are. You end up becoming a priest or a bishop or a cardinal. But the way you do it isn't by going in and shaking things up and changing things up. You do it by following order. You're following what was set before you for the last 2,000 years. In fact, the more you're like the people before you, the better you're going to, the more you try to shake things up, the more you're going to get cast aside. And so academia in theory, when it first was Plato's Academy, it's where the word comes from, was a place where people debated and contested and rejected dogma at all cost. And some, like the sort of postmodernist spirit was supposed to be Socratic, supposed to be dialectic dialogue, supposed to be you say this, well, what about this? But what's happening instead is you're getting a new, like as you said, there's a new priestly class now. There's rules, there's laws, there's dogmas. This, like, you can't say this, or you can't treat these people this way. You can't talk about these people in that way. If you're around these people, you must act like this. And it's, I don't know, for lack of a better term, it's sort of a religious binding that people end up in. And it's a daimonic spirit in itself, if you think about it, because people get literally like possessed by this daimon, this academic daimon. That's sort of, and I was a victim. I'm guilty of this myself. So I'm talking about myself here. I'm not pointing the finger and saying I'm better than anyone, because it's powerful. And when you're in these circles, you want it, like I said, you want to succeed. You want to be taken seriously. You want to make it as far as possible. And so you just sort of get sucked into it. And it's like a daimonic spirit that takes you over,
Absolutely. And something that Bronze Age Pervert wrote in Bronze Age Mind that was brilliant is that the moral relativism of the sort of postmodern, like post-Marxist academia, liberalism, it's not moral relativist in any actual practical sense. It's just a new moral objectivity with a new priestly caste being whoever it really is, at least on the service to academic institutions, right? Whether they're serving somebody else or not. And
real quick on that, because this is such a weird thing that I noticed in the last couple of years. The more I have conversations with like high level emeritus professors who taught at Yale for 15 years and wrote 10 books. What's his name? I talked to John Dillon, who wrote The Roots of this book right here. He wrote The Roots of Platonism, and he's like the go-to scholar of Platonism. Here's another book by John Dillon right here. He translates Alcanuse's Handbook of Platonism, and he wrote the book called The Middle Platonist. It's the most respected book on Middle Platonism ever. And so I have this guy on, and I'm talking to him, and I don't get the sense that he's Marxist or far left or communist or socialist. But this is the guy. His guy has all these credible medals, and he's like you look at his websites and his pages, his academia pages, and he's just littered with like all this praise of being all. And I'm talking to him. And he's just a normal guy, and like. I asked him this is a private phone call. Actually, no one knows about this actually, but whatever. We're talking about it now, so I'll just kind of say it and whatever. He's not gonna, I don't think it'll get him in trouble. He didn't say anything bad, but I kind of asked him about like the political atmosphere in academia. because I'm like, dude, you've been affiliated with Yale and Harvard and Oxford. I'm like, Matt, I'm just asking. I'm like, if you noticed the sort of, come on, I'm just being real. Have you noticed? And he's like, absolutely. I noticed it. He's like, I go, well, what do you think about it? And he's like, I don't really, I don't know. I don't. It is what it's like. He has no control over it. Someone that high. That's all he really said to me. He didn't say like he approves or disapproves or he's or I'm like I hate them or anything. He didn't. He was just like kind of. You can tell he didn't want to talk about it. He just was like whatever. But that told me something though. It told me that even somebody as established as John Dillon has no control over the sort of demonic spirit that takes over in these like circles or corners of different fields of work. And I thought that was fascinating because he's a good scholar, you know?
Yeah, and even sort of adding to that, one of the things that I think is, we live in a sort of intellectual dark age. This is something I talked about with Dr. Giorgiani. Is it's something he said himself. Like, who can you really call the only real philosophers of this day? There's very few. I consider Giorgiani one of them. I consider Nick Land, Slavoj Žižek, right? But there's not really like all these people that call themselves philosophers. I don't know if you caught the Curtis Yarvin debate with that Harvard professor.
I think I saw clips of it. Yeah.
Yeah, like I was looking into her career. There's nothing philosophically original about anything that she's saying, and she called herself a philosopher. And I think it's precisely because of this stultifying. You describe it as the daemon of academia, which does not allow for questioning. Of course, we saw what happened to Giorgiani in academia, and it happens to a lot of people too. You really can't posit original ideas that go against the new, priestly moral objectivity that's replaced the old religiosity. And one of the sort of, conflicting things I wanted to bring up is that the new, let's say, solution that this new priestly caste is called the literati or the academic class. In the past, you promise people eternity, right? You promise them the better life, which required life denial, right? It required some form of negating the physical world, whether it's Christianity or Islam or even in Hinduism. There's some element of the physical life of physical vitality that is actually inferior to, right, the eternal, the world beyond. That's what's sold, right? Eternity is sold to the masses to fall in line with the status quo. But in today, it's the opposite. It's this very temporal solution. So now it's this take inclusivity, for instance, right? Every aspect of your character needs to be affirmed in this new morality. So it's creating this very temporal, comfortable sort of thing, but it essentially functions the same as the previous solution of, life beyond whatever. Now it's a very temporal solution. Okay, you satisfy all your urges now. That's how you reach some form of satisfaction. Both are enslaving in their own ways, because obviously, if you're just satisfying all your urges in a very physical way, that's also a form of slavery. But I mean, largely to me, that seems what has been sold in modernity, because you look at the past, a lot of times the aspects of inclusivity that were absent resulted in great art. The struggle, the strife, the lack of inherent acceptance of you in society, you had to overcome to be able to create. And nowadays, you think about, this was something I talked about in a recent podcast. Tchaikovsky was a closeted homosexual, and he had to turn all that inner rage, right, of holding in, who he was, into his art, and it became beautiful. Or you take Van Gogh, for instance, or all these great artists, their mental illness was their strength. Now it's all, here's your antidepressant, here's your, okay, it's not your fault, It's creating a very temporal solution, which does not deal with the sublime. It does not deal with anything artistic. It's lacking in any sort of higher essence. And to me, it goes back to sort of what we're talking about, and it reminds me of what Heidegger says regarding technology and utility, and that if we over utilize everything, if we overly use technology to the point where we start to see everything as standing reserve, as something to be exploited, you start to curate life in such a way that when you know the exact outcome, there's no flux to build off of anymore. You live in these little, comfortable boxes where everything that you need is offered to you, and there's no more questioning. There's no more going against the grain. There's no more original ideas. And I guess
no more journey. No more journey either.
Precisely. It's only the destination. It's only the fix. Like sex now, it's not about the seduction or the pursuit or the love. It's the fix. So maybe we can sort of tie that back to chaos, and I can sort of ask a question about that. Chaos being the first sort of thing within, Hesiod's sort of ontology, I think is very life affirming, because everything that comes out of it is emergent, right? So anything that we create is also emergent rather than given to us. So you have on the one hand this very ascetic being as static thing, eternity is the true salvation, etc. And then today you have this very temporal solution where they're trying to keep you, there's really no purpose for a future life. And I guess my question is, do you sort of see flux as essential to higher life? Without flux, it seems that we just end up in this sort of spiritual neurosis, whether that's from the ultra ascetic vision or the ultra sort of hedonistic temporal vision.
Yes, exactly. I think I'm more Heraclitean than Parmenidean, I guess. If that's for anyone,
I'm with you there.
Yeah, and I think Nietzsche obviously was. But for anyone watching who's like, what does that mean? Like Parmenides was all about the being, the state of unchanging, the objectivity, logos, reason, and becoming flux was just an illusion, and it was false. It was doxa, opinion. Like it's all just an illusion, but truth is unchanging, it's eternal, and like that's all that matters. And then Heraclitus was like, no. Around the same time, Heraclitus is saying, no, actually, everything is just flux, and there really is no objective truth, or I guess there's objective truths in the sense that like 1 + 1 is 2, but he's basically saying, like, as far as like objectivity, if things are changing at every moment, the water in the river is changing, and you don't step in the same river twice, then how can we proclaim any sort of objective claims on this reality when everything's always changing? And I think the reason why I think he's right that he's right about the flux is that it sets up a sort of worldview where you're always ready to adapt to your surroundings. You're not going to be stuck into dogmatic thinking and end up in a dark age or like, and end up in just like stuck in one spot. But you're always forward thinking. You're always ready for the next horizon. You're always adding on. You're always changing. You're always adopting. And it's very Promethean. It leads to a Promethean attitude, because you're always trying to fix a problem that comes your way, rather than going, this problem came because we did something wrong and God's punishing us because we're not keeping to our dogma better enough. So you have the two different worldviews. One of them is like, everything's perfect. We just got to fix ourselves because we're the ones we're the problem because everything's perfect except for us. And the other one's saying, no, actually, we're perfect. Did you hear that? You did?
It's not an intruder, right?
No, that was thunder and lightning. It was so loud.
There we go. That's affirming. That's affirming this conversation.
Florida for you. That was super loud. I have a window open too. I hope people caught that on my microphone. That'd be kind of cool if they heard that.
I think so, yeah.
Right when I was talking about like, no, we're perfect. Boom! Zeus hits me with the lightning.
That's fortuitous.
Yeah, but I think he's right. Humanity needs to keep thriving, needs to keep going. Giorgiani has a way better way of explaining this than I am, but am I making sense? Where it's like, we're in the flux. We don't have to blame ourselves for the flux. We just need to adapt and to conquer nature with technology, with good forward thinking, intelligence, gnosis, knowledge. that type of stuff. And we need to build upon the knowledge that was before us to keep going. And like, in a way, we are striving to become like gods. We are, as we said earlier, we are like Icarus shooting for the moon. And if we don't hit the moon, we're going to be high up there somewhere. And it's going to be worth the struggle. It's going to be worth the adventure. It's going to be worth the risk, because we're going somewhere with this. We're going to put people on Mars. We're going to build a space station. We're not just going to sit here and wait for the kingdom of heaven to come to us. We're going to make the kingdom of heaven. And that is that is exactly the sort of riff that we started off this conversation with in the ancient world. The divide between, are we life affirming? Are we honoring the devas? Are we honoring our ancestors? And are we building? Or are we sort of just going, well, being is all there is, and God put us here, so let's just let God handle us all, and we're just going to be submit to him the whole time. I don't know. I think the former sounds a little bit more enticing to myself, to be honest.
Actually, I just want to scrunch up and read my tomes and stay in my musty room. I don't want to go to Mars. No, yeah, absolutely, I agree with you there. And the story of Babel comes to mind as a story of inspiration rather than a story of warning. Again, like Icarus, and I'm planning on doing an essay which sort of explores this. And really, what it comes down to as well is utilitarian thought versus anti-utilitarian thought. What we see with the priestly caste is it's trying to put forward some form of utilitarian thought. Like I said, whether it's eternity or whether it's extreme temporality today. Because with extreme temporality, living only, for physical sensation now, with no with no care for the future, then it is a life denial as well. Overly stimulating yourself physically is life denial. Nietzsche talks about this in Human All Too Human, right? And novel folklore with Giorgiani also echoes this. The need for an ontology, a history from the path to build on, to recognize the triumphs of our ancestors is part of our journey, like you mentioned. And I think what's important to note here, with something like Babel, I like, one thing I like to say is we're building a cosmic Babel out into the cosmos, into infinity. And it reminds me of what Heidegger has to say regarding technology, or sorry, actually what Heidegger has to say regarding science, and that, like, the opposite priestly caste today sort of treats this reductionist outlook, this scientific positivist outlook, as their god. Like trying to create a theory of everything is no different than Parmenides trying to say everything exists within a specific static state of being. Trying to create a theory of everything is trying to constrain existence and reality within specific laws that can't be changed, rather than what both Giorgiani and Heidegger have to say, that technology is actually what is like a lens to see reality and to see the laws and to see that they're in flux and they're changing and they're evolving. And that by doing that, we actually open ourselves up much more, both to experience and to progress. And there's so many different ways or methods I've seen in history of people trying to diagnose the same thing. And for example, are you familiar with it's in the early Buddhist discourses, there's the story of the man with the poison arrow inside of him. Are you familiar with that one? Yeah. And that's such a great, even though Buddhism, I think, comes to the wrong conclusions of how to approach life, their diagnostic is absolutely correct. And essentially the Buddha, for the listener, the Buddha is saying, so there's this man who has a poison arrow. And he says, I want to know who shot the arrow. I want to know where he comes from. I want to know why he shot me, who made this arrow. And what it's getting at is people want to know exactly what being is, whether that's through religion or through science. They have to know, rather than actually taking life as it is, as flux, as something evolving, which would be taking out the arrow. And of course, like I said, Buddhism's middle path is not something I agree with. I see it as life denying, but the diagnostic, right? Because they're phenomenological, the Buddhist. So I'm absolutely with you there on all that. And, going forward, when we look at crafting a mythos of the future, and that's why I love figures like Mithra and Prometheus, is it really is this evolving mythos. It's not, okay, this is what prophecy says, we have to do it exactly like this, but it's more inspiration, right? It's like throwing feelers out into the future. And like, what do you see people like us, for instance, who agree with this vision? What is our purpose not sort of crafting a new mythos to inspire the future in a sense?
Absolutely. I think that's what got people through the ancient world was the culture, which was determined by the myths. I mean, everything goes back to the myths. And so what you touched on is there's these two different types of divine inspiration. One of them was from the prophecy of the god at the Oracle of Delphi, which is literally Apollo. With Apollonian, it is this is the decree. This is unchanging fate. This is going to happen. Follow your follow the fate, or don't, but it's going to happen to you. The other one is Dionysian, and it's inspiration from intoxication, but it's inspiring you to it's not telling you a decree that you have to follow. You're the inspiration. You become inspired, and you are now the force of change in the flux. And so that's why it's so life affirming, because you're the one setting down the decree by yourself. Like, you're doing it. You're the one making the mythos. You're the one putting forth the culture that people are going to follow, that your ancestors are going to follow. And so I absolutely agree with you that, like, it's on us. And like, look how far humans have come. When we look at the ancient world, we look at Göbekli Tepe. I look at Göbekli Tepe as sort of a starting point of civilization. You're coming out of the Stone Age, and all of a sudden humans are able to like come together and make governments and use mathematics and build complex architecture and horse and chariots and the wheel. All of a sudden humans are putting together things that when they die and you go into the grave or you get cremated and you leave, you're gone. But the things that you put together while you're here leave a mark. And then the people after you take that and bring it to the next people, and they add to it. And then from horse and chariot, you get the modern vehicle. And from, I don't know, from different forms of, look at ancient mathematics and advanced mathematics today. It's all being built upon by the people before you. That is gnosis, and that is humanity taking control of its own destiny. It's very Promethean. And so I absolutely, we discovered that atoms and void was true. And so in a way, the old question, that used to be the old question, was Plato right that everything is forms? Or are the Epicureans right, where everything is atoms and void? And in that case, we have a natural world with natural law. And it turned out that the boring guys that no one liked were right. No one liked the Epicureans. They were like very hated by everyone. But they were right about this. And so what do you do with that? Do we just ignore it? Which I think a lot of people are doing. I think the church, I think Islam, Judaism, they just ignore this. They just go, well, we're just going to keep our statutes. We're going to keep our myths, and we're going to keep our traditions alive. And we don't care if science just totally debunks everything we've been saying. Whereas the Promethean people are going, no, we're going to, when we discover new science, when we discover new things about the cosmos, we will adjust accordingly to that, because that's truth. That's aletheia. So yeah, I think there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that we as humans have no other option than to take control and set our own culture accordingly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that sort of is tying everything together that we're getting at. We're looking at these, the force. In a sense, it's the force of Angramino versus the force of progress, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's sort of what it comes down to. It's like, are we in a point of return to something before us, or are we going to say, well, we're actually going to take the no return and we're going to just go forward? Which is why Buddhism is so close to getting it right, but then they just end up in the same. Their mashka really is no different in practice, in my opinion, than Hinduism. They're so close because they get to the point of, they say, well, nibbana, we're not going to return to the Brahman, but then they say, okay, or we're also just going to end the cycle of life. But there's something still in Buddhism. You mentioned, for example, what our ancestors build. They build the chariot, and then the chariot ends up, just regular horseback riding. And from horseback riding, we end up with more technologies. Eventually we end up with automobiles and tanks and whatever's going to come ahead of us. And in Buddhism, the idea of reincarnation, it isn't a soul inhabiting another body next. It's more like a chain of events. This leads to this, leads to this. And I think that something George Bataille talks about as death, death is part of this process, but in that process, it's really a continuity, a continuing ontology. And it's not that the soul goes on, but that we're part of nature, and we're part of this process, right? And as a part of that process, we can contribute to the future. And I think that's why it's important to recognize the people that came before us, because hopefully if we can be so bold as to assert something in our lives that we would like to be remembered, we may be temporal, but what's not temporal is being part of that ever-evolving history. If like, you sort of agree with that?
Yes, I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, but I think that's like I said, that's the sort of I think we've centralized this essential this battle, this great battle that's going on, and is very present. But
it's the eternal battle. It is. You can see why it's been so central throughout time. Is like, what do we do? Are we going to take the fruit of knowledge of good and evil and become like gods ourselves, or are we going to just submit and hope that like something out there is going to save us, and have faith that that's going to happen? I'm sorry, but I just think the latter is just kind of a cop out and kind of pathetic. But isn't it? But it's amazing how that is the most dominant worldview. If you look at Islam, Christianity, Judaism, and even some other religions too, where you're just kind of people are just hoping that everything's going to work itself out.
It's the most universal. I think that's
Yeah.
why. When it's universal, it's accessible to anyone. Of course, more people will take. I mean, if anyone can achieve this, right? Whether it's Mashka or heaven or paradise, or whatever, it's easy. You abide by rules. You're given this. We have no guarantees in the world of Flux, in the history of Flux. I mean, if what Giorgiani says comes to be, and with time travel and being able to just erase history, what we do now may not matter at all. We have no guarantees, and I think that's why so many people take the easy way, because they want the guarantees, right? Versus without guarantees, the horror walks alongside the wonder, and that's what we, hopefully, I would say, I'd be so bold as to say we're courageous enough to walk that path of horror and wonder alongside each other, and taking that risk of the horror alongside the wonder. And yeah, absolutely. But I think that really ties it together. Is there any sort of other centralizing things that you feel is important in regards to this?
The last thing I would say about that is I do think, and I've been really convinced by this recently in the last year or so, that a continuing tradition that does link us to the past is not only important, it's essential. And so a lot of times when we get in a conversation like this, you end up with, it looks like one side, the side that we're kind of bashing against, which is like submitting to God and following these law codes and just like sitting in the temple all day. Or on the other side is like, Ubermensch, Chad, the like Promethean, Aryan Chad type of thing. You know what I mean? We think of like these two. One of them is like this, like completely I make my own rules. I do my own thing. And the other one is like, I submit. But I also think that there is an essential component to the quote unquote Promethean side that people are missing, which is the customs of like the cultural customs laid down by your ancestors, by ancient cultures. And I think that is important. It's essential actually to keep something like that going. keep the fire lit, keep the hearth lit. That's why the Zoroastrians had this sacred flame. That's why in Rome they had the hearth fire always lit. This was a central thing because instead of just going out and just sort of like, becoming part of the flux, I guess you will, you are sort of putting a fire in, you're stamping your fire there, and it's an eternal symbol for you and your identity and your culture and your genos and your culture, basically your nation. And having that identity is huge. And I think a lot of times when we have this conversation, all those traits of identity and culture and a system of mythology and beliefs and culture and rituals, that always gets lumped over to the side of the people who submit to one God. And they take like a full, I guess you will, monopoly over existing culture. And then the other side kind of gets labeled as like, well, they don't even have any objectivity. They're just doing what they want. They're just like, a bunch of, like they're just doing whatever they want. And I think that if we're going to take a bite of that fruit of knowledge, have some restraint on like your morality and like your culture, and have some sort of foundation, some identity that you can keep and uphold, which is the symbol of the fire being lit for 1,000 years. And keeping that fire lit for 1,000 years is like just as crucial as bringing the flame down to the humanity. So Prometheus brings the flame down and he lights the fire, and you keep that fire there. So you keep some continuity, is what I'm saying. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I couldn't agree more. And I think, how I'll sort of, bring this all together to end this off is Nietzsche's three modes of history. The antiquarian view of history, of course, being the return to the perfect golden age, or believing history is cyclical, and you have golden ages and dark ages that are ingrained into this sort of predetermined fabric of time. But essentially this return to something that was better, something that was perfected before. If you think about the Garden of Eden, we were perfect beings until we ate the fruit, and then we became imperfect beings in a fallen world. This sense of return, which is antiquarian, which of course we reject. We also reject the critical view of history, which is that you get from Marxists and a lot of leftists, is that, well, all history is bad up until now. We have to take down, we destroy all tradition, and we have to deconstruct everything and start from a blank slate. Now, the monumental view of history is exactly what you're talking about. We are given that fire. We have a history. We have ancestors before us who we love and admire, but we're not grounded in anything that they did in terms of dogma. We're grounded in the history, in this sort of idea of reincarnation, but we don't have to do it exactly like they did. They had what they had in that context of that time, which worked in the context of that time. Even something like the 10 Commandments might have been necessary in a specific time of human history, but we don't adhere to anything that limits our ability to interact and dialogue with the cosmos as the future develops. So that precisely is what we are doing. In my project, I like to call it New Rome, because it's this idea of Rome being this cosmopolitan vision that attempted to unify all these different peoples together, in a sort of new, something that had never been done before. And of course, I think the Persians also is another empire that attempted to do this in a very good way. Of course, Giorgiani writes a lot about that, but I call my project New Rome because it's not Rome. It might not have hardly any characteristics of the old Rome, but this is this idea of humans progressing towards what I would call imperium, a cosmopolitan vision, all these different people that, sort of negate petty struggles between nations and look in this Promethean vision to expand outwards. The Faustian age on Earth ended. Everything was discovered and explored, colonized. There's no new lands on Earth to colonize and explore, but there's a whole cosmos waiting, And of course, so long as we attempt to preserve, we start to eat ourselves from the inside. This is what Nietzsche talks about, the warlike man. In times of peace, the warlike man destroys himself. This is what Bataille talks about. When you have too much excess energy and you're just trying to use it for utilitarian purposes, not for things like art and excess and these great things which have no necessary purpose for survival, but bring us further into eternity, bring us further into the sublime. Without those things, we eat ourselves up. And now we have this great vision with technology, this great opportunity to go back to that Faustian expanding and to stop just trying to preserve what little we have and go beyond, right? This is the Promethean vision. And I call it New Rome, but it may go by many different names. There's also Prometheism. There's a lot of different projects, but it's the force of progress over the force of constraint. And this is what I'm affirming. I'm sure that's what you're affirming as well. People like Giorgiani, many of our friends that we collaborate with, and I think it's a beautiful thing. And I hope that as we go forward, we can continue this fire, reigniting that fire, building the cosmic Babel, flying as high as Icarus, and then bringing in a new evolving Promethean age. But
I agree. Yeah. Well said, man. I'm glad we had this conversation.
Absolutely. Well, I'd like to have you on again at some point, but I'm really glad that you joined. Obviously, like I said, we had a lot of the same people that we collaborated with, so it's good to finally speak. Yeah. And thank you for coming on.
Yeah, man, this was great. I enjoyed this.
Awesome. Well, Legionaries, thank you for watching. If you've made it this far, you get a free Roman Eagle airdrop to you via drone. But as always, this is the Warrior Philosopher, building the foundations of the Warrior Philosophy. And we will see you next time. Ave Nova Roma.